For our next talk, we'll be welcoming Dr. Kay Stefanik to the stage. Dr. Kay Stefanik is the Assistant Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center at Iowa State University. In this role, she works to spread awareness of the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy and practices for reducing nitrogen and phosphorus loss to Iowa's water. Dr. Stefanik earned her PhD in the environmental science from The Ohio State University. With that, let's welcome to the stage Dr. Kay Stefanik.
Good afternoon. So I am going to be talking about the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, different practices in the strategy, and why we need them all. So I'm going to start off with what is the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. This is a science and technology-based framework that's been put together to both assess as well as to reduce nutrients, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus loss, to Iowa waters and ultimately the Gulf of Mexico. Now, this strategy came about kind of through a request from the US EPA Gulf Hypoxia Task Force. This task force called on 12 states in the Mississippi River Basin to come up with state-specific plans for nitrogen and phosphorus reduction. Iowa put out our plan in 2013. We were the first state to do so, and we've had about 10 years of practice implementation for nitrogen and phosphorus reductions. Within this strategy, there are two main components. There is an assessment of different management practices, agricultural management practices, things that we can put on the ground or in the ground to reduce loss. And then there's also scenario models. These are kind of to give us an idea of the scale of implementation needed. So how many of these different practices do we need to put on our landscape to reach our goals? And I first want to point out that this strategy includes both point as well as non-point sources. So reductions from point and non-points. Non-point is predominantly from our row crop acres. Point sources, a lot of that comes from wastewater treatment effluent. And if you want to know the breakdown between what's coming from non-point versus point sources, if we look at total nitrogen, about 92% of total nitrogen comes from our non-point, primarily row crop acres, and then 8% from our point sources. For phosphorus, it is 80% from our non-point and 20% from point sources. Now, with this strategy, we have a 45% reduction goal. So if we kind of take what we just had in the last slide and look at that to split up the 45%, where do those 45% reductions have to come from? 41% nitrogen reduction needs to come from non-point sources, 29% phosphorus reduction from non-point sources, and then from the point source side, it's 4% nitrogen, 16% phosphorus. So a lot of this is going to come from the agricultural landscape. Now, the main reason that this was put together was because of the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force. In the Gulf, there is a dead zone. This is the hypoxic zone. It's an area that runs along the coast of Louisiana, pretty much the entire length of the coast of Louisiana. Recently, that hypoxic zone has been about the size of the state of Massachusetts. This forms because of all of the nitrogen and phosphorus runoff in the Mississippi River Basin flows downstream into the Gulf of Mexico. Just like those nutrients fuel our crop growth, they fuel algae growth in the Gulf. When that algae grows, it forms what's called a bloom. So you have a very massive algal event. That algae dies, and as it decomposes, microorganisms that break that down are going to remove oxygen out of the water column. So you have months during the summer, especially during the summer, where there are very low or maybe no oxygen conditions in the Gulf. That is bad for wildlife. It can also affect the economy. There is a pretty big fishing economy along the coast of Louisiana, and they're seeing significant decreases in their catch rates and some other things. So problematic for them. And the goal is to eventually get this down, this hypoxic zone, down to less than 2,000 square miles. And I think this is really important. We are not looking to completely get rid of this hypoxic zone. We are just looking to reduce it to a more manageable size. Now, this graph shows kind of where we've been at on an annual basis in terms of the size of the hypoxic zone. And this is in, I believe, let's see, square kilometers. Blue bar represents the size of it at any given time, any given year. This orange is our long-term average. Purple is our 5-year average. And this blue line is the goal that we want to get down to. So you can see we have quite a ways to go to reach that goal. And it's not just Iowa, it's those 12 states in the Mississippi River Basin. And with this, you'll probably notice some years get pretty close. That's usually because of drought conditions. When we have dry conditions, water's not moving off of our landscape, so the nutrients aren't moving into the Mississippi River and the Gulf. But when we have wet years, we see spikes in the nutrient concentrations and the algal blooms. So that's why we see this kind of up and down pattern. Now, not all states in the Mississippi River Basin contribute equally. The darker colors here represents larger contributions, in this case of nitrogen. Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois are probably our biggest contributors, with Iowa not far behind. For phosphorus, it's a little more random, but Iowa still is contributing a decent amount of phosphorus to the Gulf. Now you might be wondering, how does that affect me? Why should I care about what's going on in the Gulf of Mexico? I think from a good neighbor standpoint, we want to care about it, but there are also implications for having these excess nutrients in our waterways. In Iowa, it's not uncommon to see this kind of chocolate brown water. This is from sediment. When we have sediment getting into our waterways, we have phosphorus getting into our waterways. We get algal blooms on our reservoirs. Just like in the Gulf of Mexico, we can get those algal blooms. And then when that decomposes, we end up with a hypoxic zone that leads to large-scale fish kills. And it's also a concern for drinking water. Now, there is an EPA standard for drinking water. Drinking water treatment plants have to have their water below 10 milligrams per liter nitrate nitrogen. If it's not below this, it poses a human health hazard, primarily for infants, blue baby syndrome, but there have also been more recent studies that have connected high nitrate levels to gastrointestinal issues as well as certain cancers. In Iowa, we also do see a fair number of algal blooms in our lakes and reservoirs. This can affect the local economy. Less boating, less fishing, less people wanting to swim in that water. It means less people coming to the area and spending money there. We can also get what's called harmful algal blooms. These are algal blooms that form from cyanobacteria instead of true algae. The cyanobacteria produces a toxin, and in Iowa, it's usually microcystin, which is a liver toxin. It also affects the gastrointestinal system, and if you get it on your skin, can cause rashes. So you don't want to swim in it, and you also don't want to drink it. This is pretty hard to remove from drinking water. It's not something we can easily just take out of a system. Instead, water plants that maybe are pulling from a source that has microcystin in it have to switch their sources of water. And in Toledo, Ohio, where they have a lot of agriculture in that area, they've had issues with harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie, they had to tell their residents to stop drinking the tap water because they could not find another source that didn't have microcystin in it. So we want to make sure we avoid that in Iowa. So what this really boils down to is local water body impairments, both surface water and groundwater, that can affect our recreational use, our wildlife habitat, as well as drinking water. And if you've looked in the newspaper over the past couple of years, you've probably seen beach closures, swimming not advised because of harmful algal blooms, algae blamed for large-scale fish kill because of the hypoxic zone, and then Des Moines Waterworks, they have had to switch back and forth between the Des Moines River and, Saylorville Lake and Raccoon River because of issues with both high nitrate levels and microcystin concentrations. Now, in Iowa, just like I mentioned throughout the Mississippi River Basin, not everybody's contributing the same. We see something similar in Iowa. Not all parts of Iowa are contributing the same. Areas where the colors are lighter have higher inputs to our aquatic ecosystems than areas that are darker. But throughout, there's still higher numbers that we want to see leaving our agricultural systems. And if we look at statewide trends, this starts in 2000. Nutrient reduction strategy came out in about, maybe closer to here, about 2013. And 2013 onward is when we've had practice implementation. And you can see this top is nitrogen, bottom is phosphorus. The spiky blue line is our annual average, and then the green is our 5-year running average. Since 2013, we really don't see a big decline in either nitrogen and phosphorus in our waterways. So there has been some practice implementation, but not enough. We need quite a bit more. And we have the tools to improve our water quality. Prevention is probably the best, so making sure we're kind of following best management practices, following label instructions, and we can also treat. We can put in practices that either reduce loss or treat the water that is being lost that's high in these nutrients. And these practices can be found within the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. There are practices that target nitrogen, and then there are practices that target phosphorus. And these are separate because of how nitrogen and phosphorus moves through the environment, which I'll kind of go over in a couple minutes. There are a few kind of background items that might be helpful to know before talking about the individual practices. First is how nitrate is produced in soil. Nitrate is produced naturally. We put on different forms of nitrogen to our crops as either fertilizer or manure. And then in the soil, you're going to have transformation to other types of nitrogen compounds, including nitrate. And nitrate's the one we're worried about for water quality because it is soluble in water. So it's going to leach out of the system. If you look at soils without any sort of fertilizer, manure added, we have nitrate productions in our soils from other forms of nitrogen occurring throughout the spring. And we see a peak sometime in maybe May. We don't put our crops in the ground and start growing them until kind of May moving onward. So there's a disconnect between when nitrate is naturally forming in the environment and when crops are there and could potentially take it up. And that is without any nitrogen addition. If we were to add nitrogen, that might go on in the fall, or it could go on before the crops start growing. That can cause water quality problems because we don't have the timing of application lined up when the plants can use it. One fix to this is the use of cover crops. So we plant cover crops around here. When we harvest our corn and soybean, those will start growing in the fall. And then if it's something like cereal rye, it's going to overwinter and then start growing again in the spring and can pick up that nitrate that's produced in the soil. So it can help reduce nitrate loss to our aquatic ecosystems. And I mentioned that nitrogen and phosphorus move differently in the environment. These diagrams represent where the nutrient is going. The size of the arrow represents how much or how big of a contribution it is in that direction. On the left is nitrogen. Some of that's going to be lost to volatilization and denitrification. Hopefully, the most of it's going to go to crop uptake. A little bit is lost with surface runoff and erosion. but most of what's lost ends up being leached in the system. For phosphorus, we don't have a significant gaseous phase of phosphorus, so it's not going to the atmosphere. We have a lot going to crop uptake. In Iowa, with the types of soils we have here, we see little leaching. The majority that gets lost to our aquatic ecosystems is lost through runoff and erosion. When we lose soil, the phosphorus is bound to the soil, so when we lose soil from our row crop acres, we're losing that bound phosphorus, and that's how it gets into our waterways. So when we're thinking about different practices to put in for either nitrogen and phosphorus, we need to keep in mind how those chemicals move. And in Iowa, we also have tile drainage under some of our fields. If we think of nitrate leaching in an undrained soil, that water is going to infiltrate into the ground. Some is going to go to deep percolation, might go to our aquifers, could potentially end up in drinking water, and then some is going to go through lateral flow to our streams and rivers. So even though we don't have a tile line here, you still get nitrate eventually moving to our streams and rivers in these systems. When we have tile drainage, this pipe rapidly moves water as well as dissolved nitrate to our streams and rivers. So where this may take months, this could be hours to days. And we have multiple different practices under 3 categories that we can utilize on our row crop acres to reduce these losses. We have nutrient management, which is pretty much just our 4 R's of nutrient management: right source, right rate, right time, and right place. Land use is changing up how we're using the row crop acres. We can add cover crops so that there are roots in the ground almost all year. We can change corn and soybean acres to pasture and hay. We can do extended crop rotations where maybe we add alfalfa in there somewhere. We can do land retirement, CRP, or put in things like terraces. And then edge of field practices include buffers, saturated buffers, bioreactors, wetlands, controlled drainage, and wascobs, or sediment basins. And for the most part, our undrained land, we can use nutrient management or land use changes. On our drained land, we can also use a lot of these edge of field practices. These edge of field practices, especially the saturated buffer, bioreactor, and wetland, capture the tile drainage in order to treat it. If you don't have tile drainage, you can't really put these in. Sometimes wetlands, depending on the area, but for the most part, you can't really put these in as a nitrogen treatment without the tile drainage. Now, since a lot of people may not have heard of saturated buffers, bioreactors, and wetlands, I'm just going to quickly run through what those are and how they work. These are all engineered systems. We have our corn acres here, our tile line underneath, and you can see it's going out to an ag ditch. This could be an ag ditch or a stream or a river. And with these saturated buffers, what we do is we add in a control structure that diverts water from that main into perforated tile lines along this vegetated buffer next to our waterway. This water that gets diverted is going to slowly filter through the soil and move out to our stream system. As that water moves through the buffer, there are microorganisms, denitrifying bacteria in that soil that are going to take up the nitrate, convert it to nitrogen gas, which just then goes to the atmosphere. So we end up with somewhere around, on average, 50% reduction of nitrate from the time it leaves this tile line to the time it gets to this stream. And that is going to depend kind of on the time of year. The microorganisms might act a little differently depending on temperature. But on average, we see 50% reduction. A bioreactor, or you may hear it called a wood chip bioreactor, is a pit that's dug in the ground. It's approximately 20 feet wide, 100 feet long, and maybe 4 or 5 foot in depth, that's then filled with wood chips. We add in another control structure along this line here, and we divert some of that tile water into this upper portion of the bioreactor. This water is going to slowly filter through those wood chips, and attached to those wood chips are the same denitrifying bacteria that we see in our saturated buffer. Those bacteria are going to pick up that nitrate, convert it to nitrogen gas, and once again, we see about 50% reduction of nitrate from the inflow to the outflow here. And this can be set up either so that it goes back into the tile main, which flows out into a stream or river, or it can be diverted back into a tile main that just keeps going for a while. You don't have to have the stream here like in the picture. Then there are nitrate removal wetlands. In this part of Iowa, we have what are called CREP wetlands, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program wetlands. These have tile lines routed into them, and the denitrifying bacteria are naturally occurring in the soil. These are designed so it takes water a day or two, maybe longer, to flow from the tile to the outlet. So it gives plenty of time for that water to interact with the soil and the microorganisms. These tend to be pretty shallow. You're looking at about 3-foot depth on average. And that's to maximize the water interacting with the soil and microorganisms. We also have a newer practice called multipurpose oxbows that was recently added. It's a wetland, but instead of going to this outflow, which may be an ag ditch, it's usually an old portion of a stream channel, a meander that got cut off over time, and we restore that and divert the tile line into that old stream channel. Functions in the same way as this type of wetland, though. And finally, we have drainage water management. This is where you insert control structures along your tile main throughout your field. And with this, you can raise or lower the height of that weir structure. So if you raise the weir, you increase the water table in your field. If you remove the weir plates, you're going to decrease the water level. So if we don't have crops growing on the ground, we can have more water sitting in that landscape. The longer that water stays there, the less chance there is for that nitrate to wash out. And you get the same denitrifying bacteria in our ag systems as well. It's naturally occurring just about in any sort of soil. It's just it needs the right conditions to grow. So the more water you have, the better chance you have of denitrification to occur, and less water pollution going out. Now, not all of these practices improve quality quite as much as one another. Our yellow here are our nutrient management, green are land management, and blue are edge of field management practices and how well they reduce nitrate. Nutrient management actually doesn't do as much as we'd like. There have been some people who've said, well, if we are just putting the right amount of nitrogen on our row crop acres, we're not going to have a problem. But you miss some key aspects of nutrient cycling in the environment. So while that does help, you're only going to see about a 15% reduction with these practices. With our green here, our land use changes, we see somewhere between 50 to 90% nitrate reduction. And our edge of field, they average about 50% nitrate reduction when implemented correctly. With phosphorus, we see a little more evenness between our three different categories. Our nutrient management or in-field management, our land management, and then our edge of field practices, all are somewhere around 50% up to about 90%. And these are mostly because they're reducing soil loss. Now, we have about 10 years worth of data on how well we've done as a state for both implementation as well as what we're actually seeing in our water quality. And in the nutrient reduction strategy, we've built in time. We know it's going to take time to implement these different practices. And then even when you implement a practice, it may not be functioning optimally that first year. It could take somewhere between 5 to 10 years before you get optimal functioning. And then it'll probably take somewhere between 10 to 15 years, maybe 20 years to get the implementation across our watersheds and across the state until we start seeing changes in our actual water quality. So we know this is going to take a while. but we still have a long way to go with our practice implementation. This is one example scenario that was calculated as part of the nutrient reduction strategy. For this scenario, we want to get 41% nitrogen reduction, 29% phosphorus reduction to meet the goal set out in the strategy. Both of these exceed that by like 1%. And to get to this, we need nitrogen management, so using something like MRTN on all our row crop acres with corn and soybean, about 12.6 million acres in cover crops, 7.7 million acres treating runoff from wetlands, and 5.9 million acres of land treated with bioreactors. Right now, we don't actually know how much nitrogen management there is. That's not well calculated. Cover crops were somewhere between 2 and 4 million acres of cover crops. We have less than 1% of wetlands and less than 1% of the bioreactors in place that we need. So we have a long way to go before we meet these goals, but it is possible to meet these goals. Now, if you're interested in the progress we've made so far, there is reporting. It's done as a collaboration through Iowa State University, Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, and then Department of Natural Resources. Prior to 2021, these were annual PDFs that were published. They can be found at the link here. And then 2021 onward, they switched to a virtual data dashboard on the web. This QR code goes to that same dashboard address. It has information about the strategy as well as documentation on updates that have been made to the strategy over 10 years. It goes through how we track progress. These are the reports and findings, and these include some of the previous PDF reports. And then if you were to click on this yellow button here, this takes you to the interactive dashboard. There are 6 interactive dashboards. There's one for tracking funding and resources, another for tracking human dimensions, and that has to do with education. Who are we getting this information out to? What kind of audiences are we reaching annually? And who are those audiences? And we have information on tracking permits issued to wastewater and industrial facilities. And then the other dashboards are associated with the edge of field implementation and land management. Now you might be wondering, the strategy is great, but what do I do? How do I actually go about choosing which of those nutrients in the reduction strategy to implement? And I think the first step is creating a nutrient reduction plan. And this is basically going through and figuring out what nutrient reduction practice is going to work well on your farm, what aligns with your operation and goals, and what you are comfortable implementing now, but also maintaining into the future. And I know a lot of people may not have a good idea what all of these practices are. So I'd recommend taking a look at the Whole Farm Conservation Best Practices Manual. This is designed so that there is a table at the front that gives you a quick overview of, do the practices work for nitrogen or phosphorus reductions? And then the rest of it is a series of, usually about 1 page in length, written descriptions of what each practice is. And then about halfway through the document, we have decision trees. And these decision trees, you will need information on your operation. You will go through these different decision trees, and they can help you pinpoint what will likely work on your farm. Once you've gone through and picked out what you think will work, you may also want to consider estimating your nutrient loss under current operating conditions as well as with practice implementation. And there are 2 different resources I'd recommend for estimating those nutrients. On the right here, we have an Excel spreadsheet that was put together at Iowa State University that's for estimating nitrogen loss. This is the nitrogen load estimate calculator, and it gives you space to put in information on your fertilizer application, what type of fertilizer you're using, when are you applying it, your rate, if you're doing corn-soybean rotation, continuous corn, if you're adding on any sort of cover crops. And then on the right-hand side here, you can add in how many acres are being treated by wetlands, buffers, saturated buffers, bioreactors. You can add in whether or not you have controlled drainage. And then in this green area here, it gives you output of the data. The software on the left is the nutrient tracking tool. This was put together by a group at Tarleton University in Texas with support from USDA. This software is free, it's publicly available, and what it gives you is nitrogen loss, phosphorus loss, sediment loss, crop yield information, as well as water loss estimates from a specific field. The nutrient tracking tool is designed to be used at the field scale. There's some flexibility with the end load estimate calculator. The calculator can be used either at the field scale, at the farm scale, or the watershed scale. It really depends on what you're interested in looking at. So I know this is a lot of information and kind of varied information, but there are a few conclusions that I hope you take away from this. Obviously, agriculture is an important part of the regional economy, but there are significant ongoing and growing concerns about the nitrogen and phosphorus that's being lost from these systems. They're causing problems not just in the Gulf of Mexico, but also in the state of Iowa. We have many practices to reduce nutrient loss to waterways that are outlined in the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy. It's just a matter of getting those practices implemented in a timely manner. And we also have many modeling tools that we can use to better understand how nitrogen is being lost from our current farm operations and how implementing a practice could alter those losses. Ultimately, we can reach the goals of the nutrient reduction strategy. It's just a matter of a substantial change in our thought processes, our goals as a state, and an acceleration in practice adoption. Now, I have a few resources in addition to the ones that I've shown already. This top link, it has handouts to a guide for creating a nutrient reduction plan using that manual I showed you. And then there are 2 additional handouts that are a step-by-step guide for how to use the nutrient tracking tool, and then another step-by-step guide for using the end load calculator. You can get more information on practices that are funded by things like EQIP. Just lost it. But there are federal and state programs that can fund, if not all of the cost of implementation, then at least some of it. And then in some areas, you can also stack that money to get it covered fully. So your county extension offices, NRCS, or local conservation agronomists are going to be the people who are going to be able to give you that information on the cost share. And then finally, if you'd like an overview of this presentation, I have a 4-page handout. You can either use the QR code or go to this link that summarizes everything through this talk, what the nutrient reduction strategy is, how nutrients move through the environment, and then gives information on different practices and how well they do in the environment. All right, well, that is all I have. My contact information is here if you have any questions after, or if you'd like any of those handouts or this slide set sent to you. Is there time for questions? Yes. All right, and we do have some time for questions.
On one of the pages you had mentioned cover crops, rye specifically had a 50% reduction. What is the growth of that rye? How is there a reduction if there is no rye?
There isn't, unfortunately. So that average takes into account that sometimes we just don't get growth. If we don't have good conditions either in the fall when it's planted or in the spring, we may see less reductions. I'd say some things like cover crops, if they work well, then they're going to work well. If you have a year where things don't grow, then we don't really see the reductions. With some of the other practices, like switching to pasture hay, CRP, or the edge of field practices, we don't have as much annual risk. They are closer to the average on an annual basis than what cover crops may be.
Nutrient management plans, cover crops, prep program directed towards agriculture land. But what about the suburbs, the cities, the golf courses? You know, I go to Walmart and buy a bag of fertilizer. A little gets the grass grow pretty good. A little bit more must be better. How do you educate those people? Because, you know, I grew up on the eastern shore. Farmers always had the finger pointed at them, but what about those folks that have an eighth of an acre that's putting 50 pounds of urea down to get their grass flushes and that runs off to the storm drain? The farmer gets blamed, so how do we educate those folks to join in and do their part?
All right, so I think there are kind of two parts to that question there. If we think of the land in the state, and these are just rough numbers, we're looking at about 35 to 36 million acres of land. 26 million is in row crop acres, and then somewhere closer to 30,000 is in some sort of agriculture. So that leaves between, I think, 4 to 6 million acres of land as other. As industry, as wastewater treatment plants, cities, natural areas, our lakes and streams are included in that as well. So if you look at the scale, there is a much, much, much smaller area that has those grass lawns, golf courses that are going to be getting those fertilizers as well as pesticides even getting applied to those compared to our row crop acres. And there have been some kind of back of the envelope calculations that contribution from our lawn fertilizers and golf courses is very, very minimal. But there are good practices that should be used when applying to those systems. There are, I believe if you go through, they changed the name. Yard and Garden, I think, is what the new extension kind of horticulture for backyard gardening, landscaping has been changed to. So if you go to that Yard and Garden Extension website, I believe they have information there on what are good management practices. I do think we could probably do more in terms of urban education with Extension. That's not necessarily our strong suit with Extension. We do have people doing that, but not enough. So if we had more people going out, educating these individuals with these lawns or even going out to golf courses and bringing that up, we could make a little bit of a change. But overall, it's such a small area of land compared to our ag row crop acres that it wouldn't make a noticeable difference in our waterways.
How about wastewater treatment plants, though? I constantly see in the news, especially this year with all the flooding, where coming straight from the municipalities, it's going straight into the rivers. Has anybody tried to quantify how much nitrogen and phosphorus is being contributed there?
So if you go to the tracking dashboard, there is a dashboard specifically on wastewater in industrial facilities. And at the So if we look at Iowa, these are numbers that were calculated in the reduction strategy looking at both point and non-point sources. About 8% of our nitrogen going into our waterways is coming from point sources. 20% of phosphorus is coming from point sources. And most of this phosphorus is going to be attributed to wastewater systems. Nitrogen, it's kind of close to that 8%, but there are some other factors associated with that. So that has been calculated. This is going to vary a little bit based on how wet or dry we are during a given year. But that's kind of all of the data I have, or all the information I have, but there's data on the dashboard if you want to look into specifics for that.
You indicated that between 2 and 4 million acres is being treated with cover crops, and I'm not sure why we can't narrow that down any better. But let's just take an average of 3, and we need 12 million. We've had obviously a pretty slow adoption rate of that. If it's the current adoption in 13 years to get 3 million acres, it's going to take us 50 years to get to that 12.4. Is there anything in your system that measures the progress of this over time? You know, the old temperature gauge, if you will, that shows how well we're doing. Is that on the dashboard? And what are the things that we could do to promote that, to accelerate that into a hockey stick as opposed to just a slow meandering?
So that information is on the dashboard. The discrepancy between the 2 to 4 million is the data source. Some places count the seed that goes onto the ground, but then there's another organization that is using satellite imagery to look at what actually grows. So that's why there's the discrepancy in the numbers. And then the data is on the dashboard. And sorry, what was your last question?
What can we do to
Promote.
promote it in the next 50 years, or next 13 years, so we don't have to spend 50 years waiting?
Yes, so for promotion, extension and outreach is trying to ramp that up. There's Iowa Learning Farms who put together field days and farmer partnerships to get information out to communities about why cover crops are important. I recently put together a workshop on the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, and basically taking this presentation and breaking it out, showing how to use the different tools and create a management plan. So we are maybe a little slow to get those programs, especially that workshop, out, but we are trying to reach more people throughout the state with that education. But I think partner organizations are going to be playing a key role, as well as local organizations. Farmers who have implemented these practices like cover crops, talking to their neighbors and trying to help promote these. And if there are any farmers in the room that would maybe like to put on a field day in their area but aren't sure how, if you go to Iowa Learning Farms website, they have an individual you can contact who can help you put together and help you host a field day on your farm. All right, are we out of time? All right, well, thank you.